Okay, welcome everyone to this new term series on mobile and wearable health. Our first speaker is Alex Mariakakis. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto, where he runs the Computational Health and Interaction Lab. I like the name of CHI. He's also an affiliate scientist at Tecna. So thank you again for being here, Alex, and we look forward to your talk. For the people in the audience, we'll accept questions put in the chat at the end. So, but you can progressively write them in the chat and I will read them to him at the end, if time allows. Thank you, Alex.
Yep, sounds good. Hopefully everyone can hear me. We were using this microphone earlier. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to tell you about the work that we're doing here in Toronto. Hopefully finding new doors maybe for collaboration or just mutual interest in, I think, some very shared topics of research. So the motivation of my talk, which is going to be on extending traditional healthcare, will probably ring true to many of you already. So bear with me if you are already well aware of opportunities in digital health. So the way I like to motivate this work is I'd like for you all to think about the last time you went to the doctor. Now, of course, the healthcare system in the UK might be different from it is in the United States than it is to Canada. But I think broadly speaking, I could assume that many of you don't go to the doctor every single day. In fact, let me click. Depending on your situation, maybe you have an annual checkup. Maybe you're very diligent about seeing your doctor, and that would happen on an annual basis, depending on at some point during the year. And then maybe you might have a medical emergency somewhere in between where you go see the doctor, but they don't do an overall examination of your health, but rather an examination of a specific part of your health, like maybe your foot if you come in with foot pain, or a stomach for stomach pain. But the point being with with this timeline here is that there's these large gaps where we don't necessarily have a great idea about our health, and we want to have some sort of peace of mind to be able to know, should we be seeking medical treatment? Are we doing okay? Are we recovering from whatever illnesses or pains that we might have? And there's lots of reasons for why these gaps exist. One of the reasons, depending again on the healthcare system you come from, is cost. So in the United States, where I was born and raised, the average uninsured American pays $160 for each primary care visit. And for some people, that may not seem like a lot, given all the benefits of going to the doctor. But of course, bear in mind that people who are uninsured, for people who are uninsured, this might be a big burden on their financial situation in general. Now, I've moved from the United States to Canada, and one of the common criticisms we get here in Canada, I believe it to some extent in the UK as well, is wait times, right? So while we do have a centralized healthcare system, at least 1 in 5 Canadians have to wait at least 7 days until they could see a family care doctor. So even if people want to take that initiative and go seek out medical treatment, they have to wait for a long period of time. And for some people, that even disincentivizes them from going to the doctor in the first place. Now, I'm fortunate enough to be in a place like Toronto where we have literally over 40 hospitals in the greater Toronto area, but that's not the same for all parts of a given country, a given metropolitan area, or a given continent. So in Canada, for example, 20% of Canadians live in remote areas, but they're only served by 8% of the physicians in the country. So, you can look up all these country statistics that say, this is developing world country, this is a developed country, this country has this number of physicians per capita and those kinds of statistics. But we also have to keep in mind that there is regionality to these distribution of physicians as well. So all I'm trying to motivate here is that rather than having some sort of reactive healthcare system where we need to go to a doctor only when we have a medical concern and then get feedback on our health, in the end, what we want to develop is a proactive healthcare system where we have technologies like earbuds, smartphones, and whatnot to be able to alert us potentially of cases where we may need to seek out medical treatment, or conversely, be able to identify situations where maybe we don't need to seek that care and overburden the healthcare system. So what most of my research does, and what a lot of researchers do in ubiquitous computing, and particularly in digital health, is that we try to take advantage of ubiquitous devices, things like smartphones, smartwatches, and smart rings that are already pervasive in our society, and then take advantage of the sensors that are on those devices, so things like location sensors, microphones, motion, lights, and even cameras, and then be able to identify health indicators. And I like to group health indicators based on 3 broad categories. The first being context. So context-aware computing is going to be a familiar term to many of you in Ubicomp. But by context, I'm referring to things like mood, maybe sociability. Am I around lots of people? Am I by myself? Behavior, so things like physical activity and sleep. And then physiology, so aspects like heart rate, cough rate, blood pressure, for example. And then ultimately, by developing these indicators, we can then build on top of them to be able to make higher level predictors for things like respiratory illness, aging, and psychological well-being. So the caveat I like to put at this part of the talk, depending on my audience, and I'll even do it here, is that I'm not vouching that these technologies should replace doctors. I'm not saying that anyone should be getting a diagnosis from their smartwatch that says they have cancer, they have heart failure, and they need to go get surgery. But rather, I try to be very clear that we're trying to leverage these technologies to augment the experiences of both doctors and patients as well. So a lot of people, when they talk about digital health, you'll often hear about things like diagnostic screening, right? We can detect COPD early. We can detect mental disease, mental health illnesses early on. And that's certainly a benefit that these technologies can have. Being able to deploy them ubiquitously and be able to get large-scale testing could bring a lot of benefits, help catch diseases early, and other sorts of benefits. However, I also like to think about this sometimes in the case of disease management. So rather than thinking about, just giving a whole bunch of people a digital health tool that claims to screen for COPD, I think it makes a little more sense sometimes to think about prescribing these tools. So the simple example of like respiratory illness is that if I know that someone already has a respiratory illness, then I know that they would benefit from these tools that can monitor their lung function. And in fact, you can almost think about like a diagnostic prior, right? I already know that this person is more prone to having respiratory illness. Therefore, they would benefit more from this technology and they're more likely to get a positive diagnosis, if you will, compared to, say, a 10-year-old healthy, exuberant child, for example. And then, of course, there's also benefits in terms of general wellness, right? People want to be educated about their health. They want to operate knowing that they're operating healthy, or if there is a concern, they want to be able to act upon those concerns as well. Now, because I've talked about this in terms of, distributing technologies to patients, one of the things I like to emphasize in my work is the human-centered design aspect of it. So actually, when I first started my career here in Toronto, I actually did a lot of work in the design and HCI space, partially because the pandemic made it difficult to do a lot of the studies that I was hoping to doing. But the classic example I like to give of why this is so important is thinking about weighing scales. And this is not my example. This actually came from Matthew Kay, who I believe is now at Northwestern, if I'm not mistaken. A weighing scale is one of the most ubiquitous sensors we have. A lot of homes have it. We may not think about it as a sensor, but it weighs us, right? So it is a sensor in a way. And all we get in the end is one or maybe at most two numbers like you see on the screen here. Now, let's say that I were to weigh myself on the scale here and it said I was 100 kilograms today, and then I weigh myself tomorrow and it says 102 kilograms. There are a lot of people, myself included sometimes, who will extrapolate and say, well, I went from 100 to 102, so that must mean I'm gaining weight. I might be going to 104 the next day and then the following day and the following day. But there's so many reasons why that's not true. There's uncertainty in the sensor. I could be wearing different clothing. I could be more hydrated one day versus the other. But a lot of people don't have that understanding of data. So that was a relatively simple interface that just had a single number. But if we're imagining developing all these technologies that could have a lot more intelligence in terms of informing us about their health, what happens if we start giving patients information like this, where we tell them their blood pressure, give them a reading from a PPG, claim that we could diagnose skin cancer using an app? Do we just tell people these results and then have them act on it on their own? Is it up to us to make sure that we connect people with the right resources so that they understand how to interpret that data? Or are there things we could do to give people an understanding of where these predictions are coming from? And of course, this also depends on the audience we're talking about. Are we giving these results to patients? Are we giving them to clinicians? Are we giving them to both? There's a lot of interesting research here. So my research group, the Computational Health and Interaction Lab, leverages ubiquitous and emergent technologies to address problems related to health and well-being. And I like to break my research into three broad categories. The first has to deal with momentary health assessments. So what I mean by this is, taking some sort of device and using it for a brief moment in time, kind of like a diagnostic test usually. On a separate but similar path, I look at continuous sensing. So this is thinking about more of the passive sensing angle of how do we take data collected throughout the day and analyze it in order to understand aspects of people's health. And then the third part of my research actually looks at more qualitative side of how do we design technologies that are designed for health topics broadly construed. And I'm hoping with this talk today to talk about one from each category. We'll see how I'm able to squeeze in time because I think it's a little ambitious, but I'm happy to talk about any of the projects you see on the screen, either via email or some other way as well. So without further ado, let me talk about the first project, which has to do with acoustic sensing with earbuds, which I'm sure is going to be a topic that's already familiar with to some of you. So if you think about vital signs that we're able to measure with commodity devices, here's a screenshot of what you would get from an Oura Ring, although I think this is maybe a little bit outdated. And you can see that we can get at least 3 of the 4 major vital signs. And these are classically defined major vital signs. We can get temperature, we can get heart rate, we can get respiratory rate, but we can't get blood pressure. Blood pressure over the past few years has kind of been this holy grail in a subset, at least, of ubiquitous digital health sensing because of the prevalence of hypertension and all sorts of other illnesses that relate to blood pressure. Now, if we were to take a look at existing approaches to assessing blood pressure, there are clinical devices that can measure blood pressure that either involve having a stent inserted into the bloodstream to be able to measure literally how the arterial walls are deforming. And there's also clinical grade blood pressure cuffs that exist. But the challenges of why we don't see this in everyday life are obviously they can be invasive if you're talking about inserting something into their arm, or expensive. And then also, if we're thinking about this from a clinical deployment standpoint, there's also this issue of white coat effect. So if I know that my blood pressure is being monitored, if I'm in a new environment, I'm a little nervous about my test results, there are situations where people will have an artificially elevated blood pressure. A slightly more scalable solution is consumer-grade blood pressure cuffs that we're seeing a little more ubiquitously nowadays. Some of the challenges are that they're still not really continuous. We don't get a lot of information about people's blood pressure. We only get the information when people use these cuffs. And there's also a risk that they might be used incorrectly, right? Some people don't realize that when you use a blood pressure cuff, you have to put it at a specific location of the arm. You theoretically need to rotate it so that an arrow aligns with the arm's artery. You need to have your arm level. There's a lot of things that people don't realize. So they just stick a blood pressure cuff on themselves and they get a measurement, but maybe that measurement might be incorrect. More recently, there's been a lot of work looking at using sensors, usually photoplethysmography sensors, to be able to more ubiquitously try to estimate blood pressure from the cardiac waveform. But there have been challenges associated with these techniques as well, such as poor generalizability. So if we're talking about light sensors, they can be sensitive to skin tone. And then because they're continuous sensors, they can also be subject to noise because you're wearing a sensor throughout the day and that sensor can move and that can make sensing very challenging. To give some brief overview about the ubiquitous computing sensing approaches, again, some of this might be reviewed for some of you already. A lot of the techniques that have been examined recently have to do with photoplethysmography, or PPG for short. And the basic principle is that you're shining a light into some sort of area with an artery. You're measuring the amount of light that gets reflected back, and that will depend on how much blood is in that region of the body at that time. And there's different configurations. You could have the light source and the photodiode. So one of the nice benefits of this is that it could be non-invasive and be deployed relatively continuously. But normally, people have only used this for basic cardiac information like heart rate variability. There are techniques of doing pulse wave analysis to look at the shape of that curve to get a little more information, but there's relatively limited information in that curve. However, if you go to a doctor's office, they never really measure your cardiac function using light sensors. They do it with heart sounds. And the way that a lot of people think about this is with a stethoscope that gets placed on your chest with a diaphragm. And it turns out that heart sounds have a lot of rich information. You can hear things like valve opening and closure. You can hear the presence of S1 and S2 sounds, which are different parts of the heartbeat. Lots of information in there. But using a digital stethoscope does require a lot of expertise to acquire. You need to know exactly where to place it. You need to place it consistently. If people are coughing, that could disrupt the signal as well. Now, as I'm sure some of you are already aware, that heart sounds can actually be transduced throughout the body. So yes, your heart beats, but you can hear that sound through places beyond your heart. And the way I like to motivate this is that you run in place for a couple seconds. If you've exercised really hard, you can actually sometimes feel that sensation of a heartbeat that goes all the way up to your head. And it turns out that you can actually pick up that sound using something like a noise canceling earbud. To talk about that working principle very quickly, if we're thinking about active noise canceling earbuds in particular, the way they're designed is that they have two microphones, one that's going to be sensing ambient noise. And then what the design of these active noise canceling earbuds is designed to do is to take that ambient noise and play some sort of anti-noise, essentially, to be able to cancel out the ambient noise so that you can listen to whatever music you're listening to in your earbuds. So we have these two earbuds, one that's outside of the microphone to pick up on ambient sound, and then the one inside the ear canal that is listening for what's playing in the ear so we can play this anti-noise and to make sure it's working in this feedback loop. And it turns out that this in-ear microphone is actually very good at picking up these cardiac sounds from the ear canal. So hopefully I turned on share sound to play the audio clips I have here. What I'm going to do, and you can see the signals even if you don't have them, is I'm going to play a recording of what the sound sounds like from a typical digital stethoscope here. Very clear heartbeat sounds, hopefully. And then this is what the heartbeat would sound like from a raw earbud, bearing in mind that there's all sorts of differences in hardware configuration, ambient noise, and all these sorts of considerations. So you can maybe hear something in there, but it's a little bit tough. Oh, sorry, I forgot I had the animation there. So what I'm going to talk about is one of our projects called EarStephNet, where we're actually able to take essentially what is a audio super resolution model, but we're repurposing it so that we can get the audio from the raw earbud to sound like what would come out of a digital stethoscope. So rather than thinking about a technology that's just able to measure heart rate and heart rate variability, we're actually seeing if we can recreate those critical sounds that are used in auscultation to be able to hear the characteristics of the heartbeat sound. So to beat the punchline a little bit, I'm going to play the sound that comes out of our model. So hopefully that sounds more like the digital stethoscope than does from the raw earbud. And I'm sure there's some questions that's going in your mind already of like, is this just doing noise filtering? Is it actually picking up on things? We'll get there, I promise. And there's still work to be done to really prove out that idea, but I'll get to that eventually. So the basic principle of how we developed the model for this and the data collection procedure for this is that we have a recorder where we simultaneously collected stethoscope data and earbud data at the same time. We filter the data so it's it's sampled at 16 kilohertz, and then we do some filtering as well. We break down this audio into 1.5 second short time Fourier transforms. This is basically long enough so you get multiple beats, at least 2 beats, if not more. And then we have the secret sauce, which is this model in between, which is basically, as I mentioned, an audio super resolution algorithm. But we consider this a CNN for heart sound reconstruction. I'll go into the details about what that looks like in a second, but I'm just going to talk about the pipeline first. But the output of this model is SDFT that is made where we take that earbud audio and make it sound like what would come out of a digital stethoscope. And then, of course, we can reverse the Fourier transform so that we get our reconstructed heart sound audio. So the specifics of this model that I find really cool, because it's a subtle tweak to a standard architecture that really has some benefits, is that we have a dual branch CNN architecture or a convolutional neural network architecture. So the key insight here is that we have two different kinds of kernels of different sizes. On the bottom, we have these narrow kernels that are basically the width of one standard heartbeat. And what these are designed to do is they're designed to account for or model the intra-beat features. So this part of the network is basically designed to make sure that we're getting important aspects of the S1 sound, the S2 sounds, and any murmurs that might exist. And then the top half, we have wider kernels that are made to span at least 2 heartbeats, if not more. And the idea of these is that they're intended to account for the interbeat features. So, for example, the spacing between sounds, the spacing between beats. So while the bottom side of this network is designed to account for the qualities of the heart sound, the top part of the model is essentially designed to account for the timing between those heart sounds. So to evaluate the system, we had lots of different data collection efforts that we have. But with this current data set we have 15 participants, 6 male, 9 female, and we had them go through various tasks. So we had people in resting conditions. We had them do breath holds to temporarily lower their blood pressure, and then exercise to temporarily heighten their blood pressure. And then we did multiple kinds of evaluations. We looked at whether we were able to preserve the heart sound timing metrics, so S1, S2 interval, heart sound detection rate to make sure that we're able to detect the same number of beats and not miss any beats. But ultimately, what we really care about is not necessarily just can we estimate heart rate and heart rate variability, but can we actually preserve the quality of the heart sounds that you would get from a digital stethoscope? Or are we just, filtering the audio and emphasizing the sounds without actually preserving any information? So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip talking about the heart sound timing, and I'm just going to go directly to the heart sound quality measurements. So we're using a distance metric, log spectral density, which is a log distributed measure of spectral distance, exactly as it sounds. And what I'm showing on these different rows are basically 4 different comparisons to the digital stethoscope audio. So the top row is comparing the raw earbud sound relative to the digital stethoscope. Then the middle 2 rows are 2 different kind of baseline algorithms that we use for heart sound reconstruction, UNet and EDSR. And then there's our model with the dual branch of the convolutional kernels, ear-STETHnet. And you can see that the one underlined is our approach, that we're able to get a lower LSD across the full recording relative to the digital stethoscope. But what could be happening, because we're looking at the entire recording, is that we could just be suppressing all of the sound between beats, all of that noise that basically we're reconstructing, in which case these performance gains are really just because we're doing noise cancellation and we're making the static noise you heard in the earbud super clear. So to prove that wasn't the case, or at least take a step towards proving this wasn't the case, what we did was we specifically did this noise calculation around the heartbeat sounds within 100 milliseconds to see if the actual heart sounds themselves were more similar. And again, we're able to show that ear-STETHnet was slightly better at doing this compared to other approaches as well. Now, we have a small publication on this at EMBC, but there is still the possibility that we aren't really able to preserve heart murmurs because this is going to be dependent on the distribution of your data set. If you only have healthy people, then you might take an unhealthy person and reconstruct their audio so it doesn't sound like it has a heart murmur. So as I've already spoken with some of you about, one of the things I'm really excited that we're doing right now is that we're working on developing an open source data set. I mentioned here that it's for blood pressure, but it's really for looking at all sorts of different ways of being able to do cardiac sensing with the eventual hope of doing it for blood pressure estimation. So what this data collection effort has been looking like, and we've been doing this over the past 8 months, is that we're hoping to recruit 100 people. So this is 75 people who are healthy and presumed to not have any cardiac illness, and 25 patients with some sort of heart failure or cardiac illness. We're doing 2 sessions of data collection, and then we're having them go through 4 different activities. So not just exercise and breath hold, but also submerging a limb in an ice bath, and also doing a forced exhalation. And the reason why we're going through all this effort of 2 sessions and 4 stressors is we've actually seen literature that talks about how different kinds of activities can actually influence your cardiac function in different ways. So the simple example is like exercise will change your heart rate, and that's kind of correlated with the fact that you're affecting blood pressure. But that you shouldn't just be able to predict heart rate and be able to estimate blood pressure based off of that. There's definitely situations where you can have elevated blood pressure and not an elevated heart rate. So these different stressors can actually change cardiac function in different ways. So we're hoping to see how these different activities can affect a measurement and ultimately see if we can unveil a technique that's going to be more robust to all of these stressors. And the part I'm really excited about with this data set beyond what I've already mentioned is that we're going to collect data with a lot of different sensors. So I mentioned with that study earlier that we have a digital stethoscope on the chest and earbuds that are collecting the audio data, but we're also going to be collecting, or we have been collecting, PPG data at the fingertip, PPG data at the earbud. We have a chest strap that's measuring BCG, or the chest motion. What else is on here? We have two different measurements of blood pressure. So we have an blood pressure cuff that you would use momentarily, once every 10 or 15 minutes. And then we also have a finger cuff that's measuring blood pressure continuously, so you actually get the waveform. So we've already collected data from 65, I think was the last count, healthy participants. We're about maybe 2 weeks away of getting approval to start getting our people with heart failure enrolled in the study. So we're hoping that we can use this data set not only to kind of prove this concept I mentioned earlier with ear death, but also evaluate a lot of other techniques. And one of the papers that we're working on for the IMWIT submission next week is involving part of this data set for blood pressure estimation as well. I decided not to talk about that because I think there might be some reviewers here, and I would hope that I would get a fair assessment with that work, but I'm happy to talk about that in broad levels if people are interested. So we're going to do questions at the end. Feel free to type them in the chat, but I'm going to switch gears and talk about a different aspect of our work in the continuous health sensing space. And I'm going to talk about a paper that we published at IMWIT last year involving speech analysis for respiratory monitoring, which again, I know some of you are working on as well. So there's some overlap in topics here as well. So for those of you who aren't familiar with COPD, COPD is short for chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. It is a lung impairment that usually is prevalent in older individuals, but it's a very persistent medical condition. So once you're diagnosed with COPD, it's something that you pretty much live with for the rest of your life. It accounts for 14% of annual deaths, so it's very prevalent. And it's estimated that there's roughly 212 million people living with COPD. And this was a statistic from last year, so it's probably even higher at this point, unfortunately. And as I mentioned, COPD is something that people live with basically throughout their entire lives once they're diagnosed. So it's the kind of condition that requires frequent monitoring, because at any time someone can experience an exacerbation that puts them at risk of having to be re-hospitalized. And there are various sorts of treatments that can happen for COPD to make sure that people can eventually go out of the clinic. So if symptoms go unchecked, patients risk exacerbations that lead to hospitalization. Now, there's a lot of different ways that people have proposed estimating respiratory function or understanding the function of our lungs. One of the gold standards that some of you might have seen before is spirometry, which is basically a device with a tube and a turbine where you exhale as much air out of your lungs as possible, and the turbine will spin and be able to estimate the flow of air that's coming out of your lungs. And this can give you various understandings of how much air we have in our lungs, how much we're able to force out, and various characteristics of the breathing airways like the trachea. So many consider this to be one of the gold standards for assessing lung function because you're literally assessing how well your lungs function. But not everyone can afford having a spirometer. It's a relatively specialized device. And if you've ever tried to use this before, you'll know that it's very difficult to perform without training. It's not something you can just pick up and use. You need to force as much air out of your lungs as quickly as possible and as hard as possible. And that's not a very intuitive procedure for people. So the idea of doing this at home is something that people have tried, but it's subject to a lot of different errors. Including some people I know who are on the call. There's been a lot of research that's looking at active assessments. So, for example, being able to analyze either speech that's read aloud or doing forced coughs and analyzing the characteristics of those audio recordings to be able to understand aspects of people's health. So these are relatively easy to perform. If I were to ask everyone here to read a sentence out loud or to cough right now, they'd be able to do it without any training. That's just something natural that comes to us. But it's something that can only be done a few times daily, unless people want to do it every minute. They're welcome to do it, but it would be highly annoying. And the recordings may not be representative of natural pulmonary function. Because right now, for example, when I'm presenting, I'm trying to speak clearly. Maybe I'm talking a little faster because I'm a little nervous. But that may not represent my natural lung function if I were just talking with my friends. And same thing with a forced cough. The way I would intentionally cough is very different from how I might naturally cough because I'm thinking about actually doing that activity in the first place. So there's a lot of opportunities in passive sensing, and we've already seen this with cough monitoring, where you've probably seen technologies like Hive, where people are able to detect how many coughs someone has within an hour, which can be very useful information. And to be able to analyze these passively recorded coughs, you circumvent this, concern that might occur of having natural audio clips to record, because these are natural coughs that are being recorded. And you can also get this information throughout the day without having to have any input from the user. They just wear the device, or they activate the audio recording, and then you get all the information you need. Some of the challenges with passive sensing, though, is that it's typically done indoors, so you have limited range of how long that passive sensing is happening. And it's only typically done with coughs and wheezing. A lot of people haven't looked at speech monitoring. There's obvious reasons why, due to privacy and concerns of that nature, but this is a space that we've been able to explore from an old data set that we were able to collect back in 2015 to see what is potentially possible with using passive speech monitoring. So we've developed a system called Pulmo Listener, which is able to passively detect small changes in voice characteristics to detect worsening of the lung condition. So what we have is we have a system where we, with ethics approval, I'll make that very clear, where we were able to passively record audio from COPD patient smartwatches throughout the day. There's a lot of considerations I can get into of how we were able to get that protocol approved. In short, we did a lot of processing on device, and we made sure that all of the data was obfuscated before we uploaded data to the cloud. But there are some challenges, of course, once you're working with passively recorded audio throughout the day. The first challenge you run into is, how do you know that you're actually detecting speech and not noise? So one of the things we looked at, obviously, is using a voice activity detector that's able to do exactly that, separate the speech from the noise. But just because we've detected speech doesn't mean that we've detected useful speech for our problem, because we speak with other people. Chances are I'm not speaking by myself. In this case, I guess I'm not talking with anyone else in the room, but normally we're conversing with others. So how do we know that it's the patient who's talking and not someone else? In that case, this system uses a speaker verification model where we take a couple of example recordings from an individual and use that, compare an embedding of the speech recording to an embedding from those ground truth records of the patient's speech to specifically isolate their speech. And then ultimately, once we have those recordings, we need to be able to use those to assess lung function. So then we have a model that's doing our severity classification to see, are there biomarkers that are indicative of impaired or satisfactory lung function. So in short, the way that our algorithm works here is that we have a day of audio where we break it up into hour-long periods, because we're interested in seeing trends in speech characteristics over time. Then what we do is we take a single hour of audio, and then we do various sorts of processing on top of it. So first of all, we do some noise cancellation with silence removal and spectral gating. We do some windowing that looks at, I believe, at 10-second windows, if I'm not mistaken. And what we do is that we score all of the windows within a given hour based on the likelihood that it is speech versus noise, and then the likelihood that it's the speaker, the actual patient, versus someone else who might have been nearby on the smartwatch. And that gives us basically a score for all of the windows within a given hour. Then we combine those scores together to basically give an overall score of how suitable we think a given window is in an hour for our model. And then, of course, we could just pick the one that works best for us along different metrics. We take those windows. So basically, we're given a window for each hour of the patient. And then we extract features from that speech using MFCCs that I mentioned earlier. And then we put them in classification models that I'm sure many of you have seen for doing analysis from speech to some sort of indicator of lung function. We used a basic 3D CNN in this case. As I mentioned earlier, privacy is something that's very important, and I've already mentioned some of the things that we do to account for that. So obfuscation is a big one. We do some filtering on the watch to make sure we're able to reduce some of the data that's transmitted as well. But another thing I'll point out here is that we do also get some benefit from looking at different windows. So I mentioned the 10-second window earlier, but we did actually do an experiment where we varied the length of the window that we use to represent a given hour of speech. And what we're able to find is that if you use as few as 2 seconds of audio from a given hour, and then do that for 12 hours within the day, we're able to get satisfactory results with our model. So if you think about taking a 2-second chunk of audio between 9 and 10 a.m., 10 and 11 a.m., et cetera, there is only so much that someone can say within 2 hours. And then if you imagine shuffling that, there's very limited information that you would get, even if someone's privacy was compromised. So for this study, we only had 8 participants who were suitable for this analysis, but what we did get was a lot of data from them. So these people were enrolled for 164 days on average, wide distribution because these are elderly patients. Some of them had to be rehospitalized and could no longer participate. Some people stayed on for a long period of time, but we do get a lot of richness in terms of the temporal variability in these patients. We collected audio from a Samsung Galaxy Watch that recorded audio at 44 kilohertz. And then for our outcome that we used to assess COPD severity, we used a survey called the London Cohort COPD Symptom Questionnaire. This is asking things like, do you have a sore throat? Are you coughing more frequently than usual? There is some nuance in how we use this to get binary outcomes because the definition of an exacerbation is pretty lofty. It's like having a score of 6 over 2 days. And we actually didn't have a lot of that because the nature of our participants, they were sick, but they had just been rehospitalized. So it was kind of unlikely they would be experiencing something again. But I'll refer you all to the paper to see how we handled those. So one of the analyses we did is that we looked at how many days worth of data do we need to actually get sufficient accuracy in our model, or how does the impact performance in terms of model personalization? So what I've highlighted here on the far left is what would happen if we have a patient-independent model. So this is leave one out cross-validated, predicting whether someone has heightened COPD symptoms or not. And we found that even without any personalization, we're able to get moderately, decent results. So an F1 of like 0.55, depending on how you look at it, maybe that's great, maybe that's not relatively high specificity of 0.75. And as we increase in terms of personalization, we found that using 9 days of data, we were able to personalize to get an F1 score of 0.7. Another thing we looked at actually, and this was, I was skeptical of this, but my student thought that this would be exciting and ended up working out pretty well, was how far in advance can we actually predict whether someone is going to have heightened symptoms? And what we were actually able to find is that we are actually able to see that if we looked 1 day in advance, 2 days in advance, 3 days, up to 4 days in advance, the model performance didn't actually change that much. So up to 4 days in advance, we're still able to get an F1 score of 0.62 or a sensitivity of 0.75 as specificity of 0.74. Now, we have found literature that actually supports this, that has shown that there are some ways that the speech will change in advance of heightened symptoms. But of course, I had to put the caveat that this was only tested with 8 participants. And this is something that we're hoping to investigate in future work that we're doing currently, actually. So that's our work on COPD analysis. I've got 7 to 12 minutes. So hopefully I could squeeze in talking about my third project that I'm really excited about, which has to do with multimodal menstrual health tracking. And one of the reasons I'm particularly excited about this space that we're working in is it actually spans all 3 of these research areas. As I'll talk about later, we're looking at sensors to be able to make this problem, make these devices more accurate, but we're also looking at how we design these technologies. Unfortunately, I only have time to talk about the interactive design piece, but we have papers that I can point people to look at the quantitative analysis we've done with this data as well. So for those of you who maybe aren't thinking about menstrual health that often, menstrual health is perhaps one of the most prevalent vital signs. It's not one of the classic vital signs I showed earlier in the first part of my talk, but it's an important health indicator that roughly half of the world's population cares about. And of course, it's not just women, it's really anyone with a uterus, broadly within the ages of 10 to 55. And of course, even before and after, there's considerations about how aspects of menstrual health can be important to someone. And a lot of people who menstruate will turn to menstrual tracking apps to understand some aspect of their menstrual health. So if you look at statistics, this was one I pulled from 2019, where over 200 million times various menstrual tracking apps like the ones I'm showing on the left side of the screen were downloaded. And many more people, you can imagine, probably rely on manual methods to know when they're menstruating, whether it's like a spreadsheet or just general knowledge that they've been able to accrue over the years. But there's a lot of challenges or problems that exist with these menstrual tracking apps that already exist. First and foremost is that menstrual health is way more than just about period tracking. And I mean this both from the goal standpoint. So there's a lot of reasons why people want to do period tracking. The one that most people are familiar with are things like anticipating future cycles. They want to know when their next period is going to be because they want to plan ahead in their schedule, make sure that they, maybe schedule some easy tasks during that time and things of that nature. But people also want to know about their symptoms, right? Not just when are they going to bleed, but maybe people are experiencing mood swings, cramps, or even positive symptoms, I would say, like heightened sex drive or things like that. There's actually literature that's shown that people don't always have negative mood swings, but people could actually have heightened mood during periods of menstruation. People are also curious about knowing if their health status is quote unquote normal. And I put big quotes there because you could find a lot of literature that talks about there is really no such thing as a normal health menstrual cycle. A lot of people experience things in different ways. And even for the same individual, a normal definition can really change over time. So a big caveat on that, but a lot of people want to know if what they're experiencing is clinically expected or not. And then, of course, there's this education aspect, right? People want to know what's happening with their bodies so that they can accomplish all these other goals and be able to account for and anticipate these characteristics. And underlying all of these challenges is the fact that really it's not just about menstruation biologically, but there's all these different phases where there's different aspects happening with hormones and other physiological aspects of the body. So in case you aren't familiar with the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle, I won't be referring to these directly in the talk, but indirectly we'll talk about the importance of acknowledging the fact that there's menstruation, the follicular phase, ovulation, the luteal phase. Throughout this trajectory, there's different biological processes that are happening, and we found that these ultimately impact lots of different aspects of health. Another challenge that I've already alluded to a little bit is that there's no such thing as a typical menstrual cycle. So if you were to take a look at this paper I've linked below from 2004, where 130 people were probed on what they thought was their typical menstrual cycle length, there was an average that maybe falls in line with what people would expect, roughly on a monthly cadence. You can see some standard deviations, but there was a wide range. It turns out that some people had a typical cycle that was as short as 21 days or as long as 35 days. And if you actually look at individuals and to see how many people had a range within themselves that was longer than seven days, it ends up being that almost half of the people fell in that category. So that means that 1 month, someone might have a menstrual cycle that's only 21 days, and the next month they might have one that's 28 days. So the idea of what is regular and what is typical is very variable, and that's okay. That's healthy and that's normal. A third challenge that motivates the ubiquitous computing side of this is that self-reported data is not enough. A lot of menstrual tracking apps that exist rely on very basic self-reported information like dates of menstruation, amount of bleeding, severity, cramps, and mood swings. And these baseline characteristics can change across individuals. I've already talked about irregularity, and it's very unreliable information because it's a very external experience that is being used to do this prediction. So overall, Blue is the name of my student who's working in this space. She's interested in looking at what should go into an accurate and insightful menstrual health tracker. And she was the one who proposed this project to me. I was super excited, and I said, let's run a study. So the first thing we did was a very ambitious study that we ran, is that we were able to conduct a longitudinal study for 3 months where we collected data from 4 different sources. We recruited people to collect data as they normally would with a self-reported menstrual tracking app, where they log their menstruation and symptoms on a daily basis. We also gave them a mirror hormone analyzer, which is a urinary dipstick, essentially, that will give information about a person's hormone levels. And again, we asked people to do this on a daily basis. And this gave us a gold standard, if you will. It's technically a silver standard or a bronze standard, but this can give us more precise information about menstruation, as well as the other phases that I alluded to earlier. We also had people wear a Dexcom continuous glucose monitor because there's been some literature that suggests that glucose actually varies with the menstrual cycle to some extent. And we have some statistical analysis with that again, I'm not going to talk about today, but it's at MPJ Digital Medicine if you're interested in it. And then we're also looking at Fitbit data. So heart rate, sleep, temperature, those sort of vital signs that you're probably more commonly experienced with. We've recruited both the glucose data and all of this other vital sign data continuously as long as people are wearing the devices. So we recruited 50 individuals in this protocol. We focused specifically on young adults in this study. Although we did have people with different gender identities, we wanted to keep our population relatively young and consistent otherwise, because when you're talking about menopause or menarche, which is the first instance of menstrual bleeding, physiological data can actually vary quite a bit. We did a 3-month study. So we had a part at the beginning where we did an initial intake survey. We collected data on a daily basis for 3 months. We had biweekly check-ins where we checked the data quality, and we also did some brief interviews to ask people about their tracking experiences. And then, of course, at the end, we did a study at the end to ask about people's experiences, return devices, et cetera, et cetera. And from this very ambitious study that we literally did it within the first 3 months of the student's PhD, we've done a lot of different research. So I'll be talking about a paper that we have in submission right now that looked at people's experiences with tracking, what they benefited from, what they wish they had more of, what were the challenges they encountered with their data. We'll also talk about a paper that will be presented at CHI in a couple of weeks that is looking at how do we take all this data and synthesize it into visualizations that help people extract important information about their health. I talked about I wouldn't go into the statistical analyses, but you're welcome to look at those papers. We have one that's looking at the continuous glucose data and how it relates to the menstrual cycle. And we have another one that we're about to submit next week. We're just waiting to get approval. That's looking at temperature data in the menstrual cycle. So people have already looked at this relationship, but our work is actually going to show that there's a lot of noise in the temperature data that people are relying on. There's a lot of variance within individuals that makes it maybe not as reliable as we think that other people are claiming it out to be. And then, of course, ultimately, we want to build predictive models so that we can kind of fuel all these other visualizations and tracking experiences that people have. And that's something that's ongoing. So one of the things that we learned from doing from people's tracking experiences is by giving people access to hormone data, they actually discover trends about their health beyond menstruation. So rather than just thinking about menstrual bleeding and then reflecting on their symptoms, we saw that people were able to start reflecting on aspects of their health in between those periods of bleeding. So, for example, a lot of people associate menstruation with cramps, but when we actually looked at people's data and talked with them, we found that over 50% of our participants experienced their cramps outside of menstruation. They actually found it was correlated with ovulation or their luteal phase. So what ended up happening was that people started to view their data not just, once a month, but they started looking at trends in their data on a monthly basis. And what that's inspired us to think about is how can we design future menstrual trackers that allow people to do these cycle-based comparisons and not just compare days of menstruation. Another finding that we've had is that people are actually more willing to initiate conversations about menstrual health using other forms of data, because as I'm sure some of you can imagine, menstrual health can be a stigmatized conversation that maybe not everyone's comfortable talking about. I love this anecdote from this quote that I have here, where someone was primarily raised by their father, and she was having a very tough time talking to her father about menstruation. But during our study, what she found was that she was looking at other forms of data that were still related to her menstrual cycle. So she actually started talking about that first. She talked about how tired she was during her menstrual cycle. And ultimately, that gradually led into a conversation that she felt more comfortable having about her menstrual health. Of course, this isn't always perfect. I talked about earlier how it's hard to compare people. So what we end up seeing was that there were cases where people were comparing their data across one another, and they thought that their data should have been comparable, but it wasn't. And that can lead to some undue worry where people are like, oh no, my data doesn't look like this person. So we're thinking about how do we help people naturally compare data with one another, for better or for worse, right? We need to think about how can we scaffold those comparisons. Getting low on time, so I'll go through this last part quickly. So we have some visualizations. I'm showing 2 probes here. I'm not going to go into the detail because they're very complicated and very well annotated. But the point of these is not to say that one of these is really good or bad, but they're designed with different kind of design principles in mind. So we looked at how, whether it's worth showing menstruation as a cyclical process or a linear process. We could see timelines, as I mentioned here. We also gave people anthropomorphized representations of data. So in a second study, what we did was we gave these design probes to people with fake data, and we asked them, what are the things that go through your mind when you want to investigate your menstrual health data? So to quickly talk about two of the key takeaways, one of the things we found out was that people plan their schedules linearly, but they think about their menstrual cycle cyclically. And I'll skip these quotes here. And we found that people want to be able to toggle between these things. There isn't just a one-size-fits-all solution. Another thing that I mentioned earlier is that people want to compare their trends in their data, but they want to make those comparisons fair. So one of the things that we're thinking about with these visualizations moving forward is, can we group people based on maybe similar characteristics in certain physiological data or menstrual data to be able to help scaffold those comparisons? So that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have on those projects or anything else. And these are QR codes to websites if you're interested in learning more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for speeding up your last bit. I realize that I guess questions will flow. I see some questions already in the chat. One is related to the first study. How does the complexity of your model, total parameters, compare to the considered baseline? Also, I see you have 10 sets of the two branches, if I'm not mistaken. Any architectural insights behind it? I come from the ML system as well.
Yeah, so I don't have the exact number off the top of my head. And we did do a brief hyperparameter search to get to figure out that we need 10 copies of that block, essentially. I don't think there's any profound insight other than hyperparameter tuning in that case. What I'll say at a high level in terms of the model complexity is this is not something that could be deployed directly on an earbud yet. We think you could actually get close with some optimizations like quantization and things like that. But what we're really thinking about for the sake of this application is something where the data could be streamed to, say, a smartphone or some other device with more intense computational capabilities. And we're thinking this is okay because the primary use case we have for this is for telemedicine. So if I was on a call with my doctor and they asked me to put on my earbuds, or I already have my earbuds on, and we do a brief recording like you would with a digital stethoscope, then we think it's okay to wait 5 or 10 seconds or to be able to offload the computation to something else. If you wanted to deploy this more ambiently and do recordings throughout the day, then you would definitely need to optimize the model a bit. The number is in the paper, though, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, the paper is not quite published, but it's going to be published in the coming month at EMBC.
Okay, thank you for that. The second question relates to your cardiac example again. We found that S1 peak from the in-ear audio lags behind the sound of the stethoscope. And so for your project, have you conducted any investigations on this? Additionally, sometimes in the earbud, if they're not properly worn, no hard sounds are detected. Do you have comments on this issue? I guess comments about the hardware maybe in general as well.
Yeah, and we talked about this earlier. So the hardware that we use in particular is that we take an existing earbud. It's a Sony MX1000 something. I forget the last letter. And what we actually did is we wired out that earbud directly. So we literally solder a wire onto it. And the reason why we went with that route is because we want to respect the form factor and the placement of the microphone. There's definitely some disadvantages to that. You do have a wire dangling out, and we found that can actually impact signal quality. It does also move the earbud as well, which to fit, you mentioned fit, that's kind of a problem. So let me answer the first question. So the lag is something that we're aware of. That's something we've thought about. We're hoping that with this data set that we've collected, we can investigate this even more, because synchronization with the initial study we did was not that great. But now with this data set collecting, we're collecting with the BioPack system, which allows for really robust synchronization across lots of sensing modalities. So there is a peak. You could argue that a heart sound reconstruction algorithm would be able to account for that lag, but I wouldn't rely on that, because you can imagine that lag would be very person specific, maybe depending on their size, aspects of their arterial wall, and things like that. So that could maybe motivate some person specific calibration to account for that peak. So that's something we're aware of. We haven't quite gotten to that point, but that's something that we are thinking about. With the second question about the earbuds not being properly worn, yes, we very much dealt with that. So things like how do you get, we're trying to keep the existing earbud tip, the form factor, and not change it as much as possible. But one of the small things we're doing is that we're making sure that the tip that actually goes in the ear, like the little flimsy part of the earbud, that we're making sure that that fits really well to get good sealing on the earbud, at least. And then I mentioned one of the challenges that we have with wiring the earbud is actually it could drag down the earbuds as well. So if I were to, I'm not going to go back to the picture right now, but we do have a 3D printed part to make sure at least make sure that the earbuds kind of stay in the same position, but it's not like we're pressing them inside the ear or anything. So very much a challenge. And again, why we've kind of stuck with the telemedicine case where we hope that there's kind of these considerations where people can be told to place their earbuds more firmly in order to make the data more clear.
I'm glad to see that other groups are suffering the same pain
Yeah.
that we have been suffering.
Oh, I could go on for hours. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, we can have a separate conversation on that. There's a COPD question.
Yeah.
I see the annotation were based on the COPD daily symptom questionnaires. Would you expect something systematically different in the case where spirometry would be used for annotation? Do you think something may be missed or added in this more subjective self-reporting?
I love this question. This has been a study I really want to do. I really want to do a longitudinal study where we get people to use a spirometer on a daily basis and use that as a more quantitative ground truth. I've gotten a lot of pushback on that from my respiratory collaborators or respirologist collaborators, I think rightfully so to an extent. There's a lot of concerns. First of all, people don't like doing spirometry. It's a very burdensome procedure because you're really forcing air out of your lungs. And for someone with impaired lung function, that could be a very tiring process. And we've seen very mixed literature talking about the reliability of at-home spirometry. Some people say that they find that it agrees with a gold standard done in a clinic. Some people find that it's very off because it's something that requires constant coaching and moderation. So this is something that I would like to do, and I'm trying to convince people to do. But I think if you were to try to do a study where you compare with a ground truth like spirometry, you would really need to think carefully about how reliable is the spirometry data that you're getting. Because ultimately, it's more objective, but it could be more prone to error as well. So I have my qualms with both questionnaires and spirometry, but I don't think spirometry is a golden bullet for this problem.
Thank you for that. The last comment is about the EARSTET data set, and Tong is asking if you're releasing the data, and her comment is, I view it as a general signal modality transfer problem.
Yeah.
Publishing it could inspire many ML studies, particularly in the area of generative AI. What's your comment?
Yeah. So that particular data set is not, because it was technically collected at my previous institution, and I mean, we could go back and get the approval to openly release it. But to be honest, this current data set that we're collecting, that has all the signals that we are using for EARSTET. In fact, better synchronized, as I mentioned earlier, because the original data set wasn't synchronized, plus all of the different sensors. So I'm really hoping, part of the reason I was glad to do this talk is encouraging that when you see this data set, hopefully, that you all take it up for exploring exact problems like this.
We'll certainly reach out for many reasons, but thank you for the very inspiring talk. It was definitely overlapping, as you saw, lots of interesting questions, and hopefully we can stay in touch. And thank you again for your time.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you for the audience, and see you next week.
Yep. Bye everyone. Thank you.